I've learned that the loudest room often goes silent when the quietest person finally tells the truth. On a gray autumn morning, when the sky hung low over the small town like a worn wool blanket, Ethan Brooks parked his 12-year-old pickup outside the county courthouse with the careful precision of a man who had spent his entire life protecting things he could not afford to lose. The truck rattled once before settling into silence. In the passenger seat sat an old backpack covered with faded dinosaur patches, a reminder that every decision Ethan made began and ended with his 8-year-old son, Noah. The boy smiled sleepily as he looked out the window, unaware that grown-up problems were about to test the only hero he had ever known. Ethan reached over, straightened Noah's jacket, and smiled with the kind of warmth that only fathers who had survived heartbreak could understand. "I'll be back before lunch, buddy," he whispered. Noah nodded without fear because his father had never broken a promise. As Ethan stepped out into the crisp morning air, conversations around the courthouse drifted through the parking lot like restless leaves. Lawyers hurried past in tailored suits. Reporters adjusted expensive cameras. Local officials exchanged confident handshakes. No one noticed the quiet single father carrying a worn leather folder instead of a polished briefcase. To them, he looked like another ordinary mechanic trying to survive another difficult week. That assumption lasted less than an hour. Inside the courthouse, polished marble reflected the pale fluorescent lights overhead, while old wooden benches creaked beneath the weight of impatient spectators. The building smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and decades of difficult decisions. Ethan paused for only a moment, taking in the room with calm eyes that had learned long ago that panic solved nothing. Across the hall, Assistant District Attorney Victor Hale laughed with several colleagues before glancing toward Ethan. His smile sharpened immediately. "You came alone?" he asked with casual amusement. "No attorney?" A few nearby people looked over, curiosity quickly turning into quiet judgment. Ethan answered, without raising his voice. "Sometimes the truth arrives without an expensive introduction." Another chuckle rippled through the hallway. Someone whispered that the mechanic clearly had no idea what he was walking into. Someone else predicted the hearing would be over in minutes. Ethan heard every word, yet his expression never changed. He simply adjusted the folder beneath his arm and continued walking. There was something unusual about the way he carried himself. Not pride, not fear, just quiet dignity, the kind built through years of choosing responsibility over recognition. As the courtroom doors opened, sunlight slipped through the high windows, stretching long golden lines across the polished floor. The room gradually settled into silence. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Ethan remained calm, his heartbeat steady, unaware that before the day was over, the same people quietly dismissing him would question everything they believed they understood about the humble single father standing alone before them. The clerk called the case with practiced precision, and the quiet murmur inside the courtroom faded into respectful stillness. Ethan Brooks stepped forward without hesitation, carrying nothing except the worn leather folder and a quiet confidence that seemed strangely out of place among polished shoes and expensive suits. Judge Eleanor Whitmore adjusted her glasses and studied the file resting before her. She was known throughout the county for running an efficient courtroom, where emotion rarely outweighed evidence and appearances often shaped first impressions. Her eyes lifted briefly toward Ethan before returning to the paperwork. "Mr. Brooks," she said evenly, "I understand you have chosen to represent yourself today." Ethan nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge paused for a moment longer than expected. "You understand that legal proceedings require preparation, knowledge of procedure, and careful presentation." Ethan answered calmly, "I understand that truth also requires those things." Several people exchanged amused glances. Assistant District Attorney Victor Hale smiled politely, although the confidence behind his expression bordered on arrogance. He rose smoothly from his table and buttoned his suit jacket before addressing the court. "Your Honor, this matter is quite straightforward. The county has provided complete documentation, witness statements, financial records, and timeline reports. We appreciate Mr. Brooks' willingness to appear, but the facts will speak for themselves. The words sounded polished, almost rehearsed. Ethan listened without interruption. He folded his hands gently in front of him, never looking away from the judge. Hale continued with measured confidence, presenting each document as though every page closed another door. Every statement was delivered with the certainty of someone who expected agreement before finishing his sentence. Members of the gallery nodded quietly. A reporter scribbled notes without even looking up. Everything appeared settled before Ethan had spoken more than a handful of words. Judge Whitmore finally turned toward him. "Mr. Brooks, you'll have an opportunity to respond after the county completes its presentation." Ethan answered with the same steady tone. "Thank you, Your Honor. I only ask that every document be read completely before conclusions are reached." Hale allowed himself a small smile. Every document has already been reviewed. Ethan met his eyes for the first time. Some pages are easier to overlook than others. The room became unexpectedly quiet. It was not a dramatic statement, yet something about the way he said it caused even the court reporter to pause for half a second. Hale quickly recovered. "There are no surprises here." Ethan simply replied, "I hope that is true." The judge noticed the exchange. She leaned back slightly, studying Ethan with greater attention than before. His voice carried no anger, no desperation, no attempt to impress anyone. Instead, it carried patience, as though he had already accepted that respect could not be demanded, only earned. Outside, a cool breeze brushed against the courthouse windows while clouds drifted slowly across the morning sky. Inside, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. The laughter that filled the hallway earlier had disappeared. Curiosity quietly replaced certainty. No one yet understood why the mechanic seemed completely at peace standing alone against a room filled with professionals. But for the first time that morning, people stopped seeing only his worn jacket. They began watching his eyes, and somewhere beneath the calm surface of the hearing, the first small crack appeared in a story that everyone believed had already been written. Victor Hale called his first witness with the confidence of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. County Inspector Daniel Mercer walked to the stand, straightened his tie, and took the oath with practiced ease. He appeared professional, composed, and certain of every answer before a single question had been asked. Hale paced slowly before the jury box, allowing the silence to settle before speaking. "Mr. Mercer, were you responsible for reviewing the maintenance reports connected to this case?" Mercer nodded. "Yes, I reviewed every document submitted to the county." "Did your investigation reveal significant violations?" "Yes, it did." Hale glanced briefly toward Ethan before continuing. "In your professional opinion, were those violations serious enough to justify the county's actions?" "Absolutely." Several jurors quietly wrote notes. A few spectators nodded as though every answer simply confirmed what they already believed. No further questions. Judge Eleanor Whitmore turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Brooks, you may question the witness." Ethan stood without rushing. He carried only his folder, stopping a respectful distance from the witness stand. His voice remained gentle enough that everyone leaned forward to hear him. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer." "Good morning. You testified that you reviewed every maintenance report submitted to the county." "That is correct." Ethan slowly opened his folder. The edges of the papers were worn from careful handling rather than frequent use in courtrooms. "How many reports were included in your review?" Mercer answered without hesitation. 26. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Would you please confirm the page number of the final report?" Mercer blinked once before looking toward the documents provided by the county. He flipped through several pages. Page 142. Ethan waited patiently. The room remained silent except for the faint sound of paper turning. "Would you mind checking one more time?" Mercer frowned slightly and searched again. "Yes, page 142. Ethan gently removed a single sheet from his own folder. "Your Honor, may I approach the witness?" The judge nodded. Ethan handed the page to Mercer without drama. "Would you please read the page number printed at the bottom?" Mercer looked down. His confident expression softened. 143. Ethan smiled politely. Was that page included in the official packet you reviewed? Mercer hesitated. No. Hale immediately stood. Your Honor, this could simply be an extra copy. Ethan did not interrupt. He simply waited until the judge motioned for Hale to sit. Mr. Mercer, Ethan continued, would you read the date shown at the top of that page? Mercer swallowed quietly. It is dated 3 days before the county issued its final findings. And what does the first paragraph state? Mercer looked down again. His voice lost much of its earlier certainty. It states that the reported violations had already been corrected during the final inspection. The courtroom became remarkably still. Pens stopped moving. Even the reporters looked up from their notebooks. Ethan asked one final question. If that report had been included in your review, would your professional conclusion have been different? Mercer remained silent for several seconds before answering honestly. Yes, it would have changed my recommendation. Ethan thanked him with a respectful nod and returned to his table without another word. Judge Whitmore quietly removed her glasses and studied the forgotten page resting on the witness stand. Victor Hale no longer looked toward the spectators. For the first time that morning, certainty had given way to doubt, and the quiet mechanic standing alone no longer appeared to be the least prepared person in the courtroom. The silence lingered long after Daniel Mercer stepped down from the witness stand. It was no longer the uncomfortable silence of polite spectators waiting for the next speaker. It was the thoughtful silence that appears when certainty begins to unravel. Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully placed the newly discovered report beside the official court file instead of inside it. The small gesture did not escape Ethan Brooks. Neither did it escape Victor Hale. The prosecutor rose again, smoothing the front of his suit before forcing a confident smile that no longer reached his eyes. Your Honor, he began, while the additional report deserves review, one overlooked document does not erase the broader pattern established by the county's investigation. His voice remained polished, but the rhythm had changed. The certainty from earlier that morning had been replaced by careful calculation. Judge Whitmore nodded once. Proceed. Hale walked toward the evidence table and lifted a thick binder. The county's decision was based upon months of documentation, inspections, correspondence, and financial records. This hearing is about the complete picture, not one isolated page. Several members of the gallery quietly agreed with subtle nods. Ethan remained seated, listening without interruption. His eyes rested on the binder for only a moment before returning to the judge. Hale continued presenting invoices, inspection summaries, and official letters. Every page appeared organized. Every signature looked legitimate. Every date fit neatly into the county's timeline. When he finished, he closed the binder with quiet satisfaction. The evidence speaks for itself. Judge Whitmore looked toward Ethan. Mr. Brooks? Ethan stood slowly. May I examine the binder, Your Honor? You may. The bailiff carried it across the room. Ethan thanked him with a respectful nod before opening the heavy binder on the counsel table. He did not rush. He turned each page carefully, occasionally tracing a line with his finger as though revisiting familiar ground. Nearly a full minute passed without a word. The courtroom waited. Even the air conditioning seemed louder than usual. Finally, Ethan lifted a single invoice. Mr. Hale, he asked calmly, would you please remind the court when this inspection was completed? Hale answered immediately. April 14th. Ethan nodded. And when was the invoice approved? April 16th. Ethan turned another page. Would you also read the purchase order attached immediately behind it? Hale accepted the document with visible reluctance. His eyes moved across the page before stopping unexpectedly. Ethan waited. The room waited with him. The purchase order, Hale began slowly, is dated April 18th. Ethan asked gently, can repair materials be ordered 2 days after an inspection that supposedly confirmed those repairs already existed? No one answered. Hale searched the pages again, as though hoping another explanation might appear. Ethan never raised his voice. Perhaps the dates were entered incorrectly. Hale remained silent. Ethan continued with quiet respect. Or perhaps the binder was assembled after conclusions had already been reached. The statement drifted through the courtroom without accusation, yet it carried unmistakable weight. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, comparing the document herself. Her expression remained professional, but the confidence with which she had followed the county's timeline earlier that morning had noticeably faded. She reached for a yellow legal pad and wrote several careful notes before looking back at Ethan. "Mr. Brooks," she asked, "how did you notice these inconsistencies?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Because I lived every one of those dates, Your Honor. When you're trying to keep a roof over your child's head, every receipt, every appointment, and every promise becomes something you remember." No one laughed this time. No one whispered. Across the courtroom, even those who had doubted him now watched with quiet respect, realizing they were no longer witnessing a desperate father defending himself. They were watching a man whose dignity had quietly become the strongest evidence in the room. Judge Eleanor Whitmore closed the county binder with deliberate care and rested both hands on the bench. The movement was small, yet everyone in the courtroom seemed to recognize that the hearing had entered a different chapter. What had begun as a routine proceeding had quietly transformed into a search for something deeper than paperwork. It had become a search for truth. Victor Hale took a slow breath before rising once more. The confidence that had carried him through the morning now depended upon finding solid ground again. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "the county would like to call its final witness." The courtroom doors opened, and County Administrator Rebecca Collins walked toward the witness stand with measured professionalism. She had overseen dozens of public projects during her career and carried the reputation of someone whose records were always organized. After taking the oath, she folded her hands neatly in front of her. Hale approached with renewed purpose. "Miss Collins, were you personally involved in the administrative review concerning Mr. Brooks?" "Yes, I supervised the final approval process." "Did you rely on information provided by county staff?" "Yes." "Did you believe those records were accurate?" "At the time, absolutely." Hale nodded. "Thank you. No further questions." Judge Whitmore looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Brooks." Ethan walked to the witness stand with the same calm pace that had become impossible to ignore. He offered Rebecca Collins a courteous smile before speaking. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon. Miss Collins, I appreciate your years of public service." The unexpected kindness caused her expression to soften slightly. Ethan continued, "May I ask whether you personally visited my property during the review?" "No. I relied upon inspection reports." "Did we ever meet before today?" "No." Ethan gently opened his folder again and removed a carefully preserved envelope. The paper showed signs of being handled many times but protected with great care. "Would you recognize your own signature?" He handed the document to the bailiff, who delivered it to the witness. Rebecca studied it quietly. "Yes, that is my signature." Ethan nodded. "Would you please read the second paragraph aloud?" Her eyes moved across the page. Her voice slowed noticeably. "Due to your prompt cooperation and documented repairs, the county appreciates your commitment to resolving every outstanding concern." A faint murmur spread through the gallery before fading again. Ethan asked another question, never changing his gentle tone. "What is the date on that letter?" "March 22nd. Ethan waited one respectful moment. "Would you remind the court when the county officially concluded that I had failed to complete those same repairs?" Rebecca looked toward the official file before answering almost reluctantly. "April 9th. Ethan smiled sadly rather than triumphantly. "So 3 weeks before the county determined that I had ignored the repairs, your office had already thanked me for completing them." Rebecca lowered the letter slowly. She did not search for an excuse. She simply looked at Judge Whitmore with quiet honesty. "It appears there was a serious administrative failure." The words settled over the courtroom with remarkable weight. Victor Hale closed his eyes briefly before looking down at his own notes. Even he understood there was no simple explanation left to offer. Judge Whitmore accepted the letter from the bailiff and compared it with the county records already spread across her bench. Her careful expression gradually gave way to something more personal. Not sympathy, responsibility. Ethan returned to his table without celebration, thinking not about victory, but about the little boy waiting outside who still believed his father could solve impossible problems simply by doing the right thing. And for the first time that day, the courtroom no longer saw an ordinary single father standing alone. They saw a man whose quiet integrity had exposed mistakes that authority itself had failed to recognize. Judge Eleanor Whitmore remained silent for several long moments after Rebecca Collins stepped away from the witness stand. The courtroom had grown so still that the soft ticking of the wall clock seemed louder than every argument that had filled the room that morning. She slowly removed the county letter from the evidence stack and placed it beside the official file instead of inside it, creating two separate piles where there had once been only one. It was a subtle gesture, yet everyone understood its meaning. The court was no longer treating the county's version of events as complete. Victor Hale rose again, though this time there was no trace of theatrical confidence. He spoke carefully, choosing each word with unusual restraint. Your Honor, the county acknowledges that inconsistencies have been identified. However, administrative errors alone do not establish intent or responsibility. Judge Whitmore nodded politely, but did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward Ethan Brooks. Mr. Brooks, before we continue, is there anything further you wish the court to consider? Ethan stood quietly, holding the same worn leather folder that had rested beside him all morning. Yes, Your Honor. One final document. He removed a sealed envelope that appeared older than the others. Its edges were slightly faded, but it had been preserved with remarkable care. This was never submitted because no one asked for it. The bailiff delivered the envelope to the judge. She opened it slowly and unfolded several pages. Her eyes moved across the first sheet before stopping unexpectedly. She turned to the second page, then the third. Without speaking, she passed the documents to Victor Hale. His expression changed almost immediately. Where did you obtain these? Ethan answered simply. The county mailed them to me. Hale looked back down at the papers. They contained internal correspondence between departments discussing delays in updating completed inspection records after staffing shortages had overwhelmed the office. None of the messages blamed Ethan. In fact, several employees specifically noted that his property had been brought into compliance weeks before the official database reflected the corrections. Judge Whitmore folded her hands. Mr. Hale, were these communications disclosed during discovery? No, Your Honor. Were they available to the county? Another pause followed. Yes. Nobody whispered now. Nobody shifted in their seats. The room had become completely absorbed by the quiet unraveling of assumptions that had seemed unshakable only hours earlier. Ethan remained standing. He did not look toward the gallery or the reporters. His attention never left the bench. Judge Whitmore studied him for a long moment before asking a question that surprised everyone. Why did you wait until now to present these documents? Ethan smiled gently. Because I wanted the court to hear everyone first. People deserve the chance to speak honestly before being told they are mistaken. The answer lingered in the room with unexpected warmth. Rebecca Collins lowered her eyes. Even Victor Hale seemed unable to argue against that kind of grace. Judge Whitmore leaned back slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than stern. Mr. Brooks, she said quietly, throughout these proceedings you have shown remarkable patience. Ethan gave a modest nod. My son reminds me every day that people learn more from calm voices than loud ones. Several jurors smiled almost instinctively. A reporter quietly placed her pen on the table, realizing the most important part of the story was no longer hidden inside legal documents. It was standing alone beside a simple wooden table, proving that dignity, carried with consistency and kindness, could reveal truths that authority had overlooked all along. The afternoon light had shifted by the time Judge Eleanor Whitmore called for a brief recess. Sunlight poured through the tall courthouse windows, washing the marble floor in warm shades of gold that softened the tension lingering inside the room. People who had entered expecting an ordinary hearing now gathered in quiet conversations instead of confident predictions. Reporters compared notes with puzzled expressions. County employees spoke in careful whispers. Nobody laughed anymore. Ethan Brooks stepped into the hallway, carrying nothing except his weathered folder. He did not stop to answer questions or acknowledge the curious glances following him. Instead, he walked toward the front entrance where a small wooden bench overlooked the courthouse lawn. Noah sat there patiently beside an elderly court volunteer, swinging his feet gently above the sidewalk. The moment he saw his father, his face brightened. "Did everything go okay, Dad?" Ethan smiled, kneeling until they were eye level. "We are still working through it." Noah tilted his head. "Did you tell the truth?" Ethan nodded. "Every single word." The boy smiled as though that answer settled everything that mattered. "Then I'm not worried." Ethan laughed softly before wrapping one arm around his son's shoulders. For a brief moment, the courthouse, the legal papers, and the weight of uncertainty disappeared. They were simply a father and his child sharing the kind of quiet confidence that could never be measured by titles or wealth. Standing several yards away, Judge Whitmore had paused near a window while reviewing her notes. She had not intended to overhear the conversation, but the gentle exchange reached her nonetheless. She watched Ethan brush a loose strand of hair away from Noah's forehead before handing him a homemade peanut butter sandwich wrapped neatly in wax paper. Noah accepted it with obvious excitement, as though it were the finest lunch in the world. Judge Whitmore lowered her notebook slightly. There was no performance in what she had witnessed. No audience. No attempt to create sympathy. It was simply kindness practiced without expectation. Behind her, Rebecca Collins quietly approached. "Your Honor," she said gently, "I owe the court something." The judge turned. Rebecca held another slim file in her hands. "After hearing Mr. Brooks this morning, I remembered an archived meeting from several months ago. I asked my assistant to retrieve the minutes during recess." Judge Whitmore accepted the folder. Inside were official meeting notes documenting concerns raised by several county employees about delayed record updates and communication failures. Ethan's name appeared repeatedly, not as a problem, but as an example of someone who had cooperated patiently despite repeated administrative mistakes. One sentence caught the judge's attention immediately. It read, "Mr. Brooks has remained consistently respectful despite extended delays and deserves prompt resolution once records are corrected." Judge Whitmore slowly closed the file. Across the hallway, Ethan was helping Noah zip his jacket before they walked back toward the courtroom together. The judge watched them for another quiet moment. Authority had taught her to evaluate evidence carefully, but experience had also taught her that character often revealed itself when nobody believed they were being observed. As father and son disappeared through the courtroom doors, she realized something profound had changed. This hearing was no longer about whether Ethan Brooks had fulfilled his responsibilities. That question had already answered itself. The greater question now was whether the institutions meant to protect fairness possessed the courage to admit that a humble single father had shown them what integrity truly looked like. When the afternoon session resumed, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed in ways no official record could fully capture. The polished benches were occupied by the same people. The same attorneys sat at the same tables, and the same flag stood behind the bench, yet the confidence that had once favored the county had quietly shifted toward the man who had entered that morning with nothing more than a worn leather folder and an unwavering belief in the truth. Judge Eleanor Whitmore glanced across the room before speaking. "Before closing arguments, the court has one additional matter to clarify." Her calm voice carried through the room with effortless authority. She looked toward Rebecca Collins. "Miss Collins, based upon the newly submitted documents and the archived meeting records, can you state whether the county possessed sufficient information to correct Mr. Brooks' file before formal action was taken?" Rebecca took a slow breath. She did not search for careful legal language. "Yes, Your Honor. Looking at everything together, we had enough information to resolve the matter much earlier." The answer settled over the courtroom like fresh snow, quiet yet impossible to ignore. Victor Hale lowered his eyes briefly before standing. "Your Honor, the county acknowledges those findings." There was no argument left, only acceptance. Judge Whitmore nodded and turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Brooks, you may offer your closing statement." Ethan stood slowly, placing one hand upon the counsel table instead of lifting his folder again. He looked first toward the judge, then briefly toward the gallery where reporters, county employees, and ordinary citizens watched with complete attention. His voice remained steady, warm, and remarkably free of bitterness. Your Honor, I did not come here hoping someone would lose. I came because my son deserves to grow up believing that honesty still matters. Nobody moved. Ethan continued. I know mistakes happen. I have made plenty in my own life. But when mistakes are discovered, dignity asks us to correct them instead of protecting our pride. Every person sitting in this room carries responsibilities that affect someone else's family. Mine happens to be one little boy waiting outside these doors. He paused gently before continuing. I never expected special treatment. I only hoped the same records used to judge me would also be read carefully enough to understand me. Several members of the gallery quietly lowered their eyes. Rebecca Collins folded her hands together, visibly moved by words that carried neither accusation nor resentment. Ethan smiled faintly. My father taught me that respect is easiest to give when someone deserves it, but character is measured by whether you still give respect when they do not. I have tried to remember that every day. The courtroom remained completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing. Judge Whitmore looked down at the papers covering her bench before looking back toward Ethan. Something about his final words had reached beyond legal procedure into something far more enduring. She realized that throughout the entire hearing, he had never attempted to embarrass a witness, never interrupted an opponent, and never once allowed frustration to become louder than grace. Outside the courthouse windows, the late afternoon sun slipped beneath the clouds, filling the courtroom with soft amber light. It seemed almost symbolic, as though the ordinary room had quietly become a place where humility had accomplished what anger never could. For everyone present, the hearing was no longer remembered as a dispute over documents. It had become a lesson in quiet dignity, and the silence that followed Ethan Brooks' final words carried more weight than any applause ever could. Judge Eleanor Whitmore remained motionless for several quiet moments. After Ethan Brooks returned to his table, the stillness inside the courtroom no longer felt uncertain. It felt earned. She carefully arranged every document that had been introduced throughout the day, placing the forgotten inspection report beside the county letter, the archived meeting notes beside the internal correspondence, and finally the official record itself at the top of the stack. Only after reading each page one final time did she look up. This court has reviewed the testimony, the documentary evidence, and the newly disclosed records with great care, she began. Her voice was calm, measured, and impossible to misinterpret. The evidence demonstrates that Mr. Brooks completed the required corrections before the county initiated its final action. Multiple administrative failures prevented those completed records from being accurately reflected in the official file. As a result, the court finds that the county's conclusions were based upon incomplete information. No one spoke. The judge continued. Accordingly, the court dismisses the action against Mr. Brooks. Furthermore, this matter is referred for administrative review so that similar errors do not affect other families in the future. The words settled gently across the courtroom, followed by a silence unlike any that had come before. It was not the silence of surprise alone. It was the silence that appears when fairness quietly finds its way back home. Victor Hallis stood slowly. He looked toward Ethan with genuine sincerity. Mr. Brooks, he said, on behalf of my office, I apologize. We should have looked more carefully before asking the court to decide. Ethan met his eyes and offered a respectful nod. Thank you. There was no celebration, no triumphant speech, and no trace of resentment. Rebecca Collins stepped forward next. I am sorry, she said softly, not only for the paperwork, but for the time your family lost because we failed to see what was already in front of us. Ethan smiled gently. Then let us make sure the next family does not lose that time. Even Judge Whitmore allowed herself the smallest smile. The bailiff announced that court was adjourned, yet very few people moved immediately. Reporters lowered their cameras. County employees quietly reflected upon everything they had witnessed. Several jurors approached Ethan simply to shake his hand before leaving. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun painted the trees in warm shades of amber and gold. Noah rushed toward his father the moment the doors opened. "Did we tell the truth?" he asked with hopeful eyes. Ethan knelt beside him and smiled. "Yes." Noah grinned. "Then everything is okay." Ethan hugged his son tightly, holding him for just a moment longer than usual. Across the courthouse steps, Judge Whitmore paused before walking to her car. She watched the father and son climb into the old pickup truck. The engine still rattled. The paint was still faded. Nothing about their circumstances appeared richer than it had that morning. Yet somehow they left with something far more valuable than money or recognition. They left with their dignity fully intact. As the truck disappeared down the quiet street, Judge Whitmore found herself remembering one simple sentence Ethan had spoken hours earlier. Sometimes the truth arrives without an expensive introduction. She realized that the greatest strength she had witnessed all day had not come from authority, education, or influence. It had come from a father who chose patience instead of pride, respect instead of anger, and grace instead of revenge. And long after every legal document was filed away, that quiet lesson remained, reminding everyone who had been present that real character is never measured by how loudly someone defends themselves, but by how faithfully they continue doing what is right until the truth finally speaks for them.